So for everybody watching this, I'm Chloe from Vervoe, and I have with me today Jeremy from Medibank. Jeremy, if you could introduce a bit of your background, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, certainly. So been at Medibank almost 2 years now and moved across a few different portfolios, but currently head of talent, looking after talent initiatives and our newly created home care portfolio, which is very exciting. So new to the business and new to our talent team as well.
Because with your business, actually, when you say new to the business, it's probably like if you've been there for less than 10 years, then you're a newbie. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty similar. And look, the other thing is just with the current landscape around how health is delivered, we've created this new part of our business, which is home care. And so home care for us includes community care, it includes residential aged care and services that are delivered not through your traditional hospitals and clinics. So a recent realignment means that I'm heading up the home care portfolio, and talent initiatives for us is really anything that's not in the BAU delivery. So technology, which we're obviously having a chat about today, but also other programs, university partnerships, early talent, all sorts of things. So very exciting time for us at the moment.
Absolutely. That's such a multi-layered approach when you are taking on a new offering within a large business like Medibank, and you're recruiting probably almost like a new profile or a new set of skills into the business. What does that look like for you when you were starting this out to recruit such high skill candidates and new employees? What does that look like for your business, and where did you start with that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because at the moment, we're really utilizing technology across some of our high volume streams, and that includes what we call our telehealth roles. So Medibank's one of the largest telehealth employers in Australia. And so we have almost 1,500, and that number's growing, nurses and mental health counsellors and GPs operating from home. So they're all virtual roles. And we're talking about some very niche skill sets, some very niche experience in particular areas of their ability to clinically assess and triage and provide services to a lot of Australians. So one challenge we are finding at the moment is how do we deal with the complexity of some of those requirements that are needed for people to be successful in those roles, but couple that with volume. And the traditional approach of having more people in our talent team isn't something that we're too keen to explore. And what we are keen to explore is how do we increase that quality of candidate, and also do it in a fair and unbiased way that we can adequately deal with some of those volumes, and make sure everybody's got a fair assessment of their application.
It's like, wow, where to start with that? I mean, you have so many complexities. It's a high skill, it's high volume, and it's also remote, which, I mean, that is quite unique to start with. But I suppose we're moving into a space where it's not so unique. We're getting that across any employer currently who's recruiting is often finding that profile within their business. It's the high tech roles that they wouldn't have normally done assessment for or had to do remotely. You come in and you get someone to come in for an interview for that. What has been some of the approaches that you've had to, or set structures in place for assessing with high skilled positions?
Mm-hmm. So one thing we did was, first of all, we looked at just simply reordering the talent process, the recruitment process. So traditionally there's an application, and that application gets reviewed by the recruitment team. We make some assessments based on experience and what we can see on a CV. And then there's typically a phone screen, and we start to move people through almost a linear approach where they start to build, and each stage that they pass, they progress. What we looked at is what is absolutely critical to a role such as nurse triage, for example. So these nurses need particular qualifications and experience, but at the end of the day, it is a virtual role. And so one of the critical elements they do need are proficient IT skills. So you are essentially in this role operating from home, utilizing multiple systems and screens, and you are triaging patients virtually. So that used to happen at an interview stage fairly late in the piece, and utilizing some tools like Vervoe, we've moved that to the front of the process. So what we're now doing is accurately assessing what is someone's proficiency to utilize some basic IT and systems, and their ability to clinically assess somebody using some case studies that were built. And we bring that to the front of the process. And it also enables us to increase that candidate experience so that people are either notified they're unsuccessful in a more timely manner, or we're confident they're progressing with the basic core skills that are essential, and we can focus on some other things like values and character traits and informing people of what the role is. So the first thing we did was really think about reordering parts of the process so that we brought the most critical assessment elements up to the front of the process.
It's a big shift of the way you were doing things then, isn't it? And I think that what I take from that as well is the candidate experience is still really important, which can be difficult to, I guess, scale that and difficult to control when everything gets under pressure and we get such a huge volume of candidates. You mentioned as well that, with these positions being highly technical and clinical, I think I recall that the way that you would have to do this, in the good old days almost, would be, you have to have a clinician there present to be able to help interview these people with your talent team. That burden has been removed from the clinical team, but then also how have they felt and responded to technology being enabled to be able to do that for them? I mean, that would be a bit uncomfortable, I would imagine.
Yeah, it is. And look, we had to take a few leaps of faith, actually, because with the recent COVID-19 response, Medibank was very involved in setting up a couple of different service lines, one in response to inquiries, which is where predominantly nurses were going into, and another for mental health. So one thing we did have to do quickly was essentially demonstrate to the business what that process would look like. And we took elements of what we would call it the traditional recruitment process, but the sort of question and answer style interview, and embedded that into an online assessment as well. And so essentially what we tried to do was pick out what are the key things that you would like to know up front, and can we build that into an online assessment whereby we can better qualify those candidates, and not taking away every part of the process. We still have an element of risk and compliance we need to adhere to. But what we tried to do there was bring all of those stakeholders on the journey and actually demonstrate and visually show them that we are still assessing these core components. We're just assessing them in a different manner. And you may not see them with your own eyes in an interview, but we can show you whatever the evidence might be, whether it's a score or whether it's an outcome from an assessment. So I think what's really important there is we spent a huge amount of time assessing what was required, but then also validating that back through all of the channels that would normally be accountable for some of those decisions. And the leap of faith there was really to wait and see, how does the first 50 go, first 100, first 1,000? And when you start to see the quality of those applicants come through, you can go back and readjust. But a lot of it is about, we talk quite a lot at Medibank about managing risk, not trying to eradicate it, and just having some various measures to stop and think, okay, where are we at the moment? Have we effectively assessed someone's credentials and experience and qualifications? Do we need to go back and check? And so we don't have a 100% reliance on technology, but really just picking apart the best parts from both the talent team and the interviews, which are traditionally with our clinical staff, and then the online assessments, and just really utilising each and every part of those to be able to provide value.
I love that too, because I find that in these times when people are having to make, their teams are having to adjust to a new way of recruiting with high volume in high skill, oftentimes, getting comfortable with taking on new ways of doing things, it can be difficult to bring the stakeholders on that journey. And I think that there can also be a little bit of a feeling of, is this replacing what I do? But what you've touched on there as well is that there's the human side that is irreplaceable, and we still want that. But it sounds as though as well, having technology to better dedicate that human time to the most suitable candidates, that's really where you're seeing an advantage. Have I interpreted that correctly?
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, and it enables us to respond in ways that we potentially couldn't if we were just to go faster and harder with a current process or structure. Probably a good example of that, just in the last 4 weeks, is we had to go out to market and essentially assist ramping up our mental health service with an extra 150 mental health counsellors, and it needed to be done in 10 business days. And so the conversations we have there are, first of all, what sort of headcount do we need in the talent team to be able to respond to that type of query? And it can be done. You can double or triple teams and just get more things done faster. But the second element to that is all of the other downstream functions. You need, in a traditional approach, you may need 160 interviews taking place in the business, and you may need our payrolling people services teams to process that many more contracts and onboard that many more people. And so utilizing a tool such as Vervoe just meant that for every 1,000 or so applicants that came through, and we ended up with several thousand for that particular campaign, we can just really focus our attention on the top 30, 40%, whatever's chosen, and be able to communicate with all those applicants effectively, but ensuring that we're spending the right amount of time with the candidates we think will be the best suited for the role. And so one thing we didn't have the luxury of during that particular mental health project was getting all of the other clinical teams to interview, and just having more people across every function. And so what we really had to think about there was, are there any components of our traditional approach that we could bring online into an assessment? And how much trust does the business have that that assessment would be captured and we could place some trust in it? And now we can always go back and review things like qualifications and experience and the credentials of some of our clinical staff. But it also means that we may have to review that post-hiring or in conjunction with the process and not wait for that result to come back first. So it does require quite a rethink around how the processes are conducted and also who's in control at different stages throughout the process.
I think that that's something that's really interesting to me in terms of that stakeholder buy-in and how you've been able to go on that journey as a business. So there's obviously the talent team going on a journey of, okay, what needs to be assessed and can be assessed upfront and online. But from a stakeholder journey, how have you been able to manage that? I think that's something that would be really valuable to other people going through similar ramp-ups at the moment.
Yeah. So what we ended up doing was there were really 4 key components to our recruitment process. So we have the qualifications and experience, and then we have an IT component. There's a clinical risk and assessment, and then we have the essentially the broader suitability for the role. So in terms of bringing our stakeholders on that journey, they were involved in creating those questions and answers that we were looking for as part of building our Vervoe assessment online. And so what we were essentially saying to them was, instead of doing this time and time again for every individual interview, can you spend some time with us to build what it is you're looking for? And we can do that hundreds or thousands of times automatically, but we do need your input, and we value that input as well in order to create the best process. So I think for us, it was just really involving each of those stakeholders, showing them what the potential of this particular online assessment could be, having them actually co-create that with us. And therefore, when they were seeing candidates come through and interpreting things like what their overall ranking was and that sort of thing, they knew that what they had input into in the first place was creating that. And so there's an element of trust there that the voice that they need to have in the recruitment process is a part of the assessment. And I think just on the final point on that, the stakeholders, I think the visual element's quite important. Actually showing people what does it look like from a candidate perspective, getting them to actually run the assessment themselves and look for any changes or edits, and how did they feel if they were a candidate, what would they be feeling? Does it reflect Medibank? Does it reflect how we would ask questions at interview? So actually getting those trials and tests done by people in the business meant that we revised almost 10 or 11 times before we actually set up a final version. So that was absolutely critical, because when people are really happy with the fact that their elements are included, that's when we saw the trust really ramp up, and then we just saw some really strong automation come through.
Yeah. Is that something that you found kind of unique about your usage of Vervoe? I mean, that's something that I've heard from a few other people, is that being able to customize and amend things to suit your brand is really powerful. Is that something that you found unique to Medibank, or what was helping you decide that this solution would fit your purposes?
Yeah, so I think, Chloe, you might be able to answer this at the amount of times we've annoyed you with changes. But look, I think the ability to change what we're assessing as we go is critically important. If we think about a typical interview scenario, you know, the interviewers are in control of that, and you can change the questions on the spot. And that is an absolute benefit of face-to-face interviews. But when you're setting an online assessment and distributing that link, you don't have the same luxury of being able to see how people are responding and then adjusting. So one thing we have done is taken on multiple points of feedback. We tried to do as much of that as we could at the beginning and not alter the process too much. But also based on the scores that were coming back, you know, we had a huge amount of people sitting in a middle band, and it was quite difficult to differentiate. So we were able to create a couple more layers of questions that could really differentiate people's experience and qualifications, and be able to help separate those so that we could more accurately either progress or provide them with some feedback and obviously notify the ones successful. So it is absolutely important. And, you know, for simplicity, we can jump into the dashboard and the system and obviously make some changes ourselves. But what's really important is that, particularly if other parts of the business pick up that something's not working, we can think about how that might be captured and addressed upfront during the online assessment stage.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you can just call us and we help you with that all the time.
Or just send it to you.
I love that. I always love to when I see your name pop up on my phone, Jeremy. It's no problem.
It's always a bit. Can you do this?
I get a random text message from somebody else just before too. Don't worry, you're not the only one. We like being accessible. There were some other things that I kind of picked up on from what you were saying. But one of the things that I'm noticing as a theme from what we're talking about is that candidate experience that you sort of audited as well for yourselves. Like, let's go through this as if we're a candidate, put that lens on, and what do we think? How do you think it's impacted candidate experience? And based on that, do you think you know, you would have the same response rate, etc., from doing things manually or offline?
Yeah, good question. I think there's some simple aesthetics that we didn't think of early on. I think we created something like end to end about 20 questions, and there wasn't a single image or logo in there. And I remember we had someone run through it and just look at it and think, this is just a questionnaire. You know, this doesn't look like Medibank at all. So some aesthetics around building what does a Medibank online experience look like, and it's having, you know, people focused imagery, and it's having the right branding and the right wording. So from an employee experience perspective, that was really important to us, to make sure it can be tailored to look and feel like we need it to. In terms of the online assessments, we found I think what we've done quite iteratively is actually update the communication that goes out to the candidate. We've had about 6 or 7 different draft versions of the initial email where we would send the request to complete the online assessment. And what we've found is actually bringing the candidate into the picture around why we do this and what it looks like.
Yep.
And that's really important because particularly for these recent projects during COVID where we had to go extremely fast, there just wasn't the same opportunity for candidates to call the talent team and have a chat and spend large amounts of time going back and forth before they were comfortable. And it was quite instructional. So I think, to be fair on candidates, we do ask quite a lot of them before they may even get an update on their progress or whether they know that they're being successfully moved through. And so what we've done is really bolstered the front end of communication there to say, this is an online assessment and here's what it entails, but here's also the reason why it's important. And also just giving them some comfort that it fits within a particular framework of this process, and giving them an indication of what that looks like. And if they are successful, what kind of communication will they receive? So it's got us to think a little more about what does a complete online and virtual experience look like, where we may not speak to you via phone or we may not see you face to face, but we want you to have the same engaging experience that you would if that was the case. And so building that has been a really interesting challenge because it means that we have to inform more, and we have to provide enough communication that you feel like you're getting value out of the process, whilst we're asking you to do all sorts of things and provide documentation and answers to assessments, and you're the one who's going through the ringer. But we obviously want to make you feel like it's two-sided and we're giving you equal amounts of value. So I think to answer your question, Chloe, I think it's really changed the way we think about what an online candidate experience looks like, or what a virtual candidate experience looks like. And just being honest that it is different. It is different to a face-to-face experience. And so we can't just simply take one away and plug it into another. We have to really think about what that journey looks like.
Yeah. It's also, as you mentioned, it's thinking about the profile of your candidates as well. I would think that in this particular sector that you were talking about, we're talking about clinicians, and we're talking about, people from a very medical background who might not have normally had to be exposed to this type of recruitment. I mean, many of us have not been exposed to this type of recruitment in this new world. So I like that the concept around it was thinking about, how do we help this type of persona of candidate? What's important to them, and giving them really big context and the why about how this is being done and why this is being done would have made a really positive impact for them as well. But, why was the decision made though? And, maybe I'm going backwards here, but why was the decision made not to just go, all right, let's just do a whole bunch of online interviews instead, like in terms of let's just Skype everyone, or let's just video call everybody? Why have you chosen a more technical way when considering that candidate persona? They might have preferred that, or we might have predicted that they would prefer that type of approach.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think we often talk about the reasons why we're conducting things like online assessments, and it can change. We're okay that we don't settle on the one thing and just run with it forever. In this instance, there was two things. There was we needed to assess clinical quality and the core skills of the role without having the luxury of being able to interview. We just didn't have the sheer number of people in the talent team and also out in the business to be able to interview that many people that quickly. And so then that creates an efficiency question around how do we do it all faster. The key thing for us was, rather than just assess, for example, the first 200 through and maybe hire 150 of them, for example, how do we actually assess all 2,000 applicants in a 2-week period and still be able to select the best 150? So that in combination was really the thinking around, theoretically, we could probably get more people to CV screen and more people to conduct phone interviews and more people to interview from the business. But is it actually the most efficient and also the best way to find the right quality within that batch? And the reality is, if we do go down that path, it's really important to think about, for example, the 1,000 candidates that we may not have been able to get to. And so just because they may have applied 2 days after somebody else, it's not particularly fair for us just to put them in the missed out bucket. And it was really important to try and capture and assess as many of those applicants in the 2 weeks as we possibly could. So I think, to answer your question, Chloe, is that we wouldn't be able to interview 2,000 people in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But what we could do is utilize this tool to more accurately and in quite an unbiased way assess everybody's application during that period. Yeah. And that's what gives, from a talent perspective, we think about what are the outcomes of the business. So their business is obviously looking for the best people in the right roles. But from a talent perspective, what we're trying to do is assess as many people as we can and try and make choice for the business as well. So what we were able to do is, I think we saw something close to about a 90% completion rate of our online assessments, which is, I don't know if that's a great number or not. To me, it's quite phenomenal.
But we think it is too.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Having 90% of all applicants complete that process, which allowed us to then communicate with them, provide them with some feedback, and then also manage the best quality candidates through the process, is something that just wouldn't be able to achieve, I think, through sheer volume of going faster and harder using a more traditional process.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I've got all of my Vervo-based questions and all of my questions based on your process at the moment. But,
Yeah.
this is also about our talent community are all adjusting and trying to adapt to this new way of working. Something that I notice a lot in, I guess, your approach, and I think if I'm not exposing too much of your personal passions, but I really appreciate your approach and consideration to mental health and balance and that type of thing. What's been critical for your team in maintaining that and keeping, you under a phenomenal amount of pressure with these high volumes of and fast deadlines and a lot of things changing. How are you supporting and advising your team to manage that side for themselves as well?
Very hot topic when you work in a business that's focused on health and well-being, Holly. But so there's probably a few different levels to it. I think what we have seen is everybody from Craig Drummond, our CEO, and the executive leadership team, and all of our senior executives have been very proactive about making sure that our employees are having check-ins with them, and they're trying to understand how the broader workforce is coping with this particular environment. We've seen some monumental shifts. There are some roles in the business, such as corporate roles, where we know there's a high proportion of people that do work from home. And so at the moment, health and wellness is probably more about how they work more regularly than they usually do. But we've also seen some big changes to the business, such as moving our call center, who has only ever been based physically on site, and actually shifting them into a virtual environment. And so what we have done is essentially been pretty constant on understanding how are people feeling, what support do they need, how do they want to design their days, and how do we not just simply move everything that would have happened in a meeting room or face-to-face to an appointment in your calendar with a Zoom link or a Skype link, and actually think about how those interactions are taking place. So just recently we sort of switched immediately to phones, which was pretty quick, but we just started to really realize the value of video. And I know our team logged on early this week and had a sort of all team meeting, and the comments were, oh, it's just nice to see someone's face. So there's some really simple things in there. One thing that we are speaking about internally as a business is how does this now change people's choices when they do come back to a more normalized environment, and not just go back into the old way of working? Does it provide more choice or more flexibility, and can the business support health and wellness elements in a very different light, given that we may not all be back physically again for some time, and we may not choose to be? People's preferences may also change now that there's more exposure to people's partners and families. And I know quite a few people that are far more active at the moment throughout the day, just given that they've got a little bit extra time at home. So Medibank has been very proactive in developing some health and wellness programs, and there's quite a lot going out through LinkedIn and through our Live Better app as well, that can be accessed and downloaded by anyone, which has a pretty much a central focus on eat, move and feel, and things that people can do now in an at-home or a virtual environment, which is more of an iteration compared to what it used to be, which required people to get out and see people and complete activities. But I think it's really just adapting. It's adapting to what are some of the things like health and wellness mean in different environments, and what does it mean if, for example, you can't leave your home and you need to access things online or content or connecting with people. So I think everybody's doing it, but there's team yoga sessions that are in the diary, and recipes get shared, and pictures of people's lunches and all that sort of thing. So look, I think it's very hard to replace some of the face-to-face activity, but the adaptation is how do we keep engagement and people connected, and still have those conversations that people obviously value really highly.
That's really cool advice. I like hearing what you guys are up to as well. So I guess maybe lastly, with everything that's going on, and like you said, there's this environment that we're in today that we're quickly adapting to, and there's a vision for the future maybe as we get there. But what's your advice or your general overview of things for our talent community? Things that you think that you've been experiencing from or learned from quite quickly, or what your focus is moving forward? What would you like to share?
So I think, look, one thing we've done on this journey is consulted the broader talent community, and I think that's probably the one valuable thing. If there are any people out in the talent landscape or HR or just in business in general that are looking at perhaps something that may be a little risky or untested or unknown, we spent quite a considerable amount of time speaking with other organisations that had done similar things just to get their thoughts and what worked and what didn't. And it just gave us a level of comfort that if we were going to go down this path, that we weren't really going to break anything dramatically, that there is still a risk involved there. But I would say understanding what that risk is and then weighing it up with what the benefits could potentially be. We're still managing a level of risk in terms of how we are moving people through some pretty fast processes. But we do have some stop gates in there and some measurements to be able to reflect back and consider whether we've made any mistakes in the process. So I think, for us, this was a pretty big leap of faith, but it was one that was really the enabler to be able to achieve what we needed to for some of our external clients in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So we wouldn't have been able to do it without some online assessments. But at the same time, there was already a level of comfort that we knew people had done things like this before. We do have some external connections and networks that we talk with about what their experiences are. And I think that's probably the key thing, is just not doing things on your own at the moment. Medibank can be at times a pretty large and future-focused company, but in other circumstances, we may need to lean on others who have done things that are bolder and more innovative than us. So just being really honest about what we're trying to achieve and perhaps who can help us on the journey. And one thing I've noticed, particularly in this current environment, is just how keen people are to jump on and have a chat and hear a different voice and maybe think about something that's not their sort of daily grind. So I'd be encouraging people just to reach out and utilise their network and just really see what's possible.
Yeah, that's awesome advice. I like that. Because conversations like this even are just, I enjoy this part of my day. I enjoy being exposed to a different business's approach to things and what they're learning and what they're trying and what the outcomes can be. And like you said, I think that for some businesses, it's almost been a way to force them to try things that they're a little bit, should we do that? Should we not? Is it going to work? It's just speeding up that decision making, and then they're going, yeah, this is working. Doing something a little bit differently is working. Is there anything finally that you'd like to share? I mean, you've been so generous in your time and advice, and the things that you've been going through with the business and the changes. Is there anything finally that you think could be, that you would like to share or mention today?
Look, I think at risk of not wanting to lecture anyone, I think the main anchor point for us has just been that candidate experience and the candidate journey. And what we've been really good at is identifying some people within our team, but also outside of our team, that do have that lens in spades. So, whether you've got whiz-bang intelligence around process or systems or assessments or anything else like that, somebody just needs to take that view, whether it's candidates themselves that can perhaps provide some feedback, or maybe even someone with, sort of high level of empathy around how someone's feeling. I think at the end of the day, what we think is best is probably only speculative until we actually get people to come through and give us that feedback that it is something that they've enjoyed or found valuable or feel like they were treated in the way they should have been. So I think at the end of the day, that candidate experience and the journey they have is really the only thing that people can hang on to, because without it, candidates that aren't engaged are typically not going to progress through, and you may be missing some opportunities. So I'd probably leave everyone with that. But given we've had Vervoe involved in the process, just seeing some of that feedback and score come through and the sheer number of people that were able to complete it, I think is a pretty good indication that we've built something. It's not perfect, but we'll continue to build it and improve it as we go.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for having that faith in us and letting us come on this journey. It's something that I know our team are really proud to have been able to work on with you. Like seeing those figures, seeing the work that you've been able to ramp up, the volumes, the the outcomes that you've been able to ramp up so quickly is something, we're just so excited to have been part of with you. So continue to call me anytime you need anything. Send us those
We will,
requests.
don't worry.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Thanks,
so
buddy.
much, Jeremy. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. We'll speak to you soon, I'm sure.
Will do.